Hello everyone, as we slowly make our way into the virtual meeting room. There seems to be a bit of echo going on there too, so hopefully whoever had it on mute's turned it off. Hi everyone, my name's Peter Lewis. I'm wearing the hat of Director of the Centre for Responsible Technology today. And welcome to what is going to be a regular tech talk that we're convening through the Australia at Home platform. I'd also like to introduce my guests and partners in crime, Lizzie O'Shea, who's the chair of Digital Rights Watch and also a lawyer at Maurice Blackburn, and Daniel Stinton, who's the managing director of Guardian Australia, who's also one of the sponsors of this project. Before we get cracking, just want to do the acknowledgement and respect of traditional owners. I'm on land of the Gadigal people, the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and recognise this land was never ceded, and I join you in paying respects. I also want to shout out to friends in Melbourne, including Lizzie, who are subjected themselves to the next stage of lockdown, and obviously one of the reasons we got this project started in the first place was to create a point of connection for people through the lockdown, and we could share ideas and keep a little bit of a base for, you know, some supportive discussions that interrogate where we're up to in this moment in history. So on that note, let's get cracking. Today we were going to talk about three issues, and I guess we're using this idea of a tech talk to really spend some time and use the platform to unpack what are really big issues that have elements of politics, elements of technology, elements of society, and us as consumers and citizens. So we're going to look at three different areas that have been in the public debate over the past couple of weeks. The success or otherwise of the COVID Safe app, the idea of whether data can actually ever be private and whether de-identification works, which is kind of technical but also really, really important. And finally, Tik-Tok and why it's a geopolitical threat at the moment, or is it? So that's going to be the sort of we'll look into each of these issues. We'll encourage you to, as always, use the chat, ask questions, make comments on the way, and we'll definitely bring all of you into the discussion. And as we always do, encourage you to have your gallery on gallery view and have your camera on so we can get a sense that we're all in this together. So on that note, let's start with COVID Safe. If we turn our mind back 2 or 3 months, this was the app that we were going to download to, I think the Prime Minister called it sunscreen, to keep ourselves safe so we could go outside when the virus is around. And 3 months in, I know there's been some stories running in the last week that there hasn't actually been a lot of activity sort of picked up by the app. And I think particularly in Melbourne, where contact tracing is now a serious challenge, it's kind of shooting a few blanks, the app. So Lizzie O'Shea has done a bit of thinking about the performance or otherwise of the COVID-19. So I might get you to kick this off, Lizzie, with your reflections on where we're up to and whether the app has lived up to its promise.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot actually, because when this was first proposed, there were a lot of people in civil society organisations, Digital Rights Watch being one, that expressed a lot of concerns about the proposal as put by the government. And it was a very frustrating time because there was so much strong rhetoric around how this app would allow us to reopen our economy. You know, there was a headline talking about those who were refusing to download it, comparing them to anti-vaxxers, which I thought was particularly unhelpful. But then the comments made by Scott Morrison that you mentioned, Peter, in the press conference, comparing it to sunscreen. And I think it's now very remarkable, really, that we're now 3 months later and, you know, Bill Shorten referred to it as an expensive dud. And it's really kind of largely disappeared from a lot of the discussion, at least by politicians. The advertising is still out there, of course, but it's much more pared back, and it's part of a broader strategy around trying to limit the spread of the virus. So activists and, you know, commentators, experts expressed a few different concerns. I think the first one really is, to what extent can you rely on these apps to do the work of contact tracing? And a lot of people, I think, in the process of developing these apps realised that it was no substitute. Even the developers who worked on the Singaporean one, which was the leader really in this field, the first country to deploy it widespread, one of them has talked about how it was never going to be a substitute for manual contact tracing, and that there are real difficulties in expending huge amounts of resources on a technical solution to what is a social problem, that what requires, resources to do the manual contact tracing to be able to effectively contain the virus. And then there's a second aspect to this, which I think is interesting as well, which is that the take-up rate in a lot of these cases of apps around the world has been very low. So we know that about 50 countries have developed apps. There's been about 80 of them in total. And the take-up rate has generally been quite low. So Iceland is kind of modelled as the example here. They had a take-up rate of around 38%. They did have a very good set of policies surrounding it. But, of the 80 apps that I mentioned before, about a fifth of them have no privacy policy whatsoever. And at least half of them don't talk about when they're going to dispose of data, no clear boundaries around that. So that kind of deficit in public trust did play out, I think, in the take-up rates. So even in Singapore, which is not a country that's known for its rebellious nature in relation to government projects, the take-up rate was still only around a quarter. And in Australia, it's I think, still a bit lower than that. And this then does mean that the effectiveness of the app is compromised. And I think if we've learnt anything out of this period, it's that government needs to do better at developing these projects so they work and that they do what they say they do. And we have expertise to be able to make that work, but often government doesn't rely on them and rushes through these things inappropriately. But secondly, I think a deficit of public trust in these kinds of projects has real-world consequences, and it does compromise any efficacy that you might have. So even the best designed app can't work if people aren't prepared to use it because they're suspicious about what it's doing. And I really think that's an important thing to remember, and we shouldn't let our politicians off the hook in future when they try to pitch these kinds of things without addressing the fact that, we've had a long time where governments interfered with our privacy or ridden roughshod over rights, and that then can create problems like this in future.
Although I thought with the take-up or the development of the particular technology, at least in the Australian context, it was interesting. And at the time, I thought quite striking that normally technology is imposed on us, but because the government actually needed the public to buy into this technology, there was an interesting negotiation that went on where they were really clear about where the data wouldn't go. They were really clear about how it would be deleted after a certain number of days. And I remember talking to a number of the digital rights groups, and it was really hard to find, at least in Australia, the privacy hill to die on. I think that in a way it was the best practice way of introducing a technology. So yeah, I think, yes, there's that sort of tech exceptionalism that tech would be the solution, but I'm also, part of me is disappointed that it hasn't worked, because I thought it would have been a good story to be saying that we've actually negotiated technological change in a positive way. And as Dave's already said in the thing, maybe it will prove its usefulness over time. I'll bring Dan Stinton in. Dan, you're one of the people that has downloaded the app you were telling us before. So what was your thinking, and any regrets?
No regrets. I mean, look, my thinking, I share your concerns. I don't think this app was never going to be a silver bullet, right? I think it was potentially just another tool to help with contact tracing. And I think my take on it was simply, if it's going to help even by identifying a handful more people, then it's worthwhile doing. And I guess, look, perhaps my comfort from this is just knowing how much data is actually collected on us over the course of a normal week anyway. And I just think that at least with this app, I mean, I share the concerns that the government potentially can collect my movements and invade my privacy, but at least I can delete this app if I want to. But I mean, if you try and get through a week without using a Google or Facebook app, I mean, it's basically impossible. And they're collecting a lot more information on us than what this app ever was. And so for that reason, I guess I just thought it was the benefits outweighed the downsides.
What about the costs I don't know if you call it an opportunity cost, but there's definitely a cost in putting that much effort into public education to download a piece of technology. And I think the number was something like $70 million in public advertising to tell people to get out there and get the app. I guess you're living it now in Melbourne, Lizzie. Maybe there were better ways that money could have been deployed in terms of public education.
I would have thought so. I mean, I think it's also a mistake to sort of assume that it didn't have an impact on how people behaved, even if they didn't download it. You know, I was on the night that the public housing towers just down the road from me got put into hard lockdown, there was a billboard on display that said, "Get back out there on COVID safe." And it's got pictures of people having a cup of coffee, you know, together, as though this app was like a form of sunscreen when it's not. And that kind of mixed messaging, I think, does set us up for a fall. And it's easy to blame people for not complying with various rules that are set down. I think lots of people, the vast majority of people, are doing their absolute best. But I also think public messaging is pretty important in these crises, and we shouldn't look past government failures in that respect and consider how these kinds of projects can have very negative implications. I did just, though, want to take up Dan's kind of privacy fatalism there, because I understand his concerns about, you know, how you get through a week without various companies collecting info on you. And that's a very legitimate concern. And I suppose the response I'd take to that is, firstly, I don't think the government should model its privacy practices on Facebook and Google and the like. We need to absolutely interrogate why those companies are allowed to get away with that and address it. And we should be having gold standard for government projects. And, you know, let's elevate everyone's privacy level as a result of an exercise like this, not feel despondent because we feel like we've already lost privacy. But the second thing I suppose I would say is that Facebook and Google are remarkably different from governments, and governments, you know, are deploying, you know, ADF officers. They're not, they've got police at their disposal. They're finding lots of people in Victoria. It's quite a different power arrangement that you have, I think, with your government as opposed to a private company, and that's important to keep in mind.
I make the point that, Lizzie, I don't think the point that Peter made earlier is valid here, and that is that I don't think that the COVID Safe app was modelled on the data collection policies of some of these larger companies. I think it was a better process, not perfect by any means, but the fact that there was a commitment to deleting your data is, you know, a substantial difference between what some of these larger companies are doing, right? So totally. I guess for that reason, you know, it was, look, I wasn't completely comfortable with this because by virtue of the fact that there's data being collected on us anyway, I was uncomfortable with it as well. But I just felt that if it was going to potentially help trace people and help stop the spread of this virus, that was a trade-off I personally was prepared to make. I accept that others might, wouldn't come to that view, but just to clarify my position.
That's fair enough, Dan. We don't always have to agree, and I completely accept it. And I'm not trying to demonise people who download it. The thing I would say as well, because you described it, Peter, as a bit of like a failure. You wish it had worked. And one of the things I would say is I agree with you. I think the legislative framework, even though it was introduced after the app was launched, which was a bit of a disappointment, and eventually the fact that the code was made open source, I think these are really good achievements. I think we should be really proud of the fact that we've managed to have a debate about this and get better practice from government. And I think there's a lot to be said for taking those victories into the future and say, well, this is what we kind of expect next time you are rolling out a project, that you'll look at the expertise available in the country, you'll comply with best practice standards, and we should be really pleased with that. I think it's a lot better than it could have been. I share still some concerns that there could have been improvements, but overwhelmingly, I'm really pleased that we managed to advocate and get a better framework for it than we could have otherwise had. So
is there any signs anywhere in the, like, is this the end of the development of this technology? Is everyone gone, we've done as well as we can, we've given up? Or is there movement going from, you know, you're hearing about Google continually to be working on this. If it's not working anywhere in the world, does that mean the technology, that idea of Bluetooth technologies are done, or does it just mean that we still haven't got the technology right?
Oh, I think this is a really interesting question that's still on the table. There's all sorts of ways in which I think the tech that we had could be improved and used differently. I think we are going to struggle to get any greater take up, and I think Singapore's an instructive example of that. There are also then associated problems, like Singapore has had a second wave, even though it was celebrated as getting the virus under control for a variety, and in the context in which they had schools open, for example, and this tech was part of it. But their second wave also originated in need tower blocks of people who are guest workers, who are often deeply exploited. And there's a digital divide here as well. We're often the people who are most vulnerable to the virus, maybe because they're elderly, or maybe because they're not connected, or, they're poor, they're living in cramped environments. They're much less likely to have access to the technology that might stop the spread, that helps with contact tracing. So I think there is a limit to this kind of technology in a context in which we have quite a strong digital divide. It's never going to replace this kind of manual efforts that we have to engage in. And I think if we're going to focus our efforts and our resources, probably it's on streamlining that process and allowing it to be responsive and quick, rather than investing in technology in future.
Monika's just put a really interesting broader question in the chat, which is how do we align practices by data scientists in big corporations with legal frameworks? I know we've all spoken with Ed Santo from the Human Rights Commission and some of the work he's trying to build into the development, particularly of AI being compliant with discrimination law. And I do think there is a line between the way we've developed this technology, albeit without the success that the government may have wanted, and the broader thought that there needs to be a negotiation between citizens and developers of new technology and the legal system on the way that technology is rolled out into our society. So, while, we're sitting here at the moment saying that this experiment is not what you call a roaring success at the moment, it does open up some interesting opportunities, because this isn't going away. Like we're going to be in this situation, I would imagine, for the next year or two. So I can't see tech giving up on this. Can you, Dave?
Sorry, I was on mute. I think I've been getting a bit of an echo. No, and I don't think we should. I mean, to your point, I think that we're going to be living with this for some time to come. And I still think that there is potential for this technology to be a tool to help. It's certainly not going to be, a complete solution ever. I think it's always going to probably be secondary to sort of the more manual contact tracing. But if it can help and get better, which I think it has the potential to, we should keep working on it.
We've got a comment in the chat from Scott about some of the frameworks in the EU. I don't know if Scott wants to have a chat or whether I should just read it out. Are you around there, Scott? I really made AFSA work quickly to find him. But so if you're there, Scott, speak up. Otherwise, I'll just read it out. The EU's come up with principles for contact tracing apps. For member states, the principles include users must be in control of their data. So quite a few EU countries have decided to go with the Google Apple framework. That was the other split in Australia, wasn't it? About whether to go with the big tech solution or the sort of locally produced product.
Or also to make use of the fact that Apple and Google were collaborating to allow access to certain information that's collected by smartphones that in other circumstances wouldn't be permitted, and whether government chose then to build something making use of that accessibility and we didn't, other countries have. I mean, I think it is telling that we don't have, I don't think, sufficient protections for privacy. We don't have a human rights instrument in Australia, which sets us apart from all our contemporaries in the international community. And that does impact our ability also to design and have discussions in the process of design these kinds of apps, and it's disappointing, I think, that we do really need to kind of build our literacy in terms of understanding questions of privacy and how they're not necessarily in conflict with public health initiatives. And I think if we did have a human rights framework, that would help. The other thing I was just going to mention is that one of the organisations that did start developing a contact tracing app in an open source way was the Red Cross, and I do wonder whether we might see some non-governmental organisations enter this space as well. And you could see a situation where people might be more inclined to trust a non-government organisation with a good reputation to build technology that's likely to be effective. And it seems a bit of a missed opportunity as well, to my mind, that wasn't something that was potentially pursued. But I think next time we encounter a crisis like this, it may well be, because I do agree with you, Dan. I think this that tech's always got to have a role to play in public health, but it's a question of getting it right and getting the trust necessary to make it work. And I think this is a chance to reflect on some other opportunities that were missed, as well as what went wrong in our particular example.
There's a great question in the chat from Monika, if she wants to come online, who has clearly picked up one of the deficiencies in this particular panel. She's asking about the lack of, and it's always been a bit of an issue, that the lack of technologists in this discussion. So a lot of this is driven by political activists and campaigners. But are you there, Monika?
Yeah, I am. I just, I'd rather not uncover my camera at the moment. Just, sleep times have been spanning out. But yeah, this is a major issue that I've witnessed as a data scientist. And I also have a law background. So sort of being on the front lines, doing like the data wrangling work and answering questions for big organizations. I guess you see that most of my colleagues, I mean, they're not thinking about, with the implications of something are good or bad, and they're not even encouraged to think about it. They're just told, like, there's a problem and you need to optimize it, whether it's identifying people in a massive corporate that could be high potentials and, putting in some data that identifies them and then, flows on the opportunities that are available to that by signaling to someone, via an app or a dashboard that this person's worthwhile. There's no conversation about, well, what data is missed, what people are missing out. If you only identify high potentials by past performance, are we cutting out women who take mat leave? None of that's included. And we're given puzzles all the time about how to optimize things. And, now that databases in big organizations are so linked, everything from surveys that you do online, I mean, there is no way to anonymize all of that to, how people pay for things, to how many times people can log on. All of that is linked. And like, we do interrogate those things, and people at the sort of coalface, for lack of a better word, we're not trained in the OAIC principles. And I feel like kind of no one really wants to talk to us. Maybe it's because my people aren't that personable and outgoing. I'm really striving in this to make my points, but it's just, I think that it would be really worthwhile to have someone who is in that space on the panel. Like the level of literacy here is clearly like awesome compared to something like the Congress hearings.
Consider yourself on the panel for the rest of the day, just for starters, Monika. But you're actually right. It's kind of a little bit like scientists and climate change. There was a long time where the scientists were doing their work and the public was in a totally different place. And there's been a lot of effort to help scientists communicate with the public. That's the first point. The second point, it struck me as well when I started looking into this world, the lack of ethical frameworks around the industry. Lizzie's a lawyer. There's legally enforceable ethics. I used to work as a journalist. There's a code of ethics there, less so in politics. But I think there's a bit of work being done around AI, but it's really specifically around the design of AI, as if ethics is part of the output rather than an overriding frame for the industry.
I would just say, Monika, that I love talking to technologists, and I think actually there's lots of I think cross-disciplinary responses to these political questions is actually the only way we're going to get good outcomes, because what you do need is both a tech mindset and legal understanding, as well as an appreciation of how people in the real world, like your most vulnerable users, for example, will respond to a particular development in the tech, as opposed to just the everyman user, which is usually what they're designed for. And I think there are technologists who are working in this space that are very interesting and innovative. And I also think, there's bridge builders on the other side as well. And I like to think that's hopefully what civil society is developing over time, so that we can be better placed to respond to these questions and have a really informed public debate.
If I might make just one more,
You go.
Okay, just one more point, which is something that, as someone who applies, systems that make decisions that impact, they do impact on people's opportunities, on, whether, something gets reviewed, on whether they have a promotion opportunity, maybe, hypothetically speaking. So I feel that a lot of the discussion around privacy is that, people will be able to identify you. There's these mass volumes of data, and they'll be able to identify you. And it's still that idea of they'll be able to know who I am. But I think that the conversation really needs to start coalescing on the fact that there is so much data about you, that organizations already do have this. What data are they using to make decisions that are going to have a consequence to the individual, you know, whether it's in the banking space, the work space, you know, the education space. And robo-debt was a prime example of that. Like, if something is going to be used in an automated way to make a decision about you, how do we assess the decision-making framework or inputs that it's using to ensure that the high consequence automated decisions aren't hurting people? That's it from me. Yeah.
Thanks, Monika. Dan.
Look, it was sort of a related point, but I think Monica's just identified something which I've often grappled with, and that is
You've just grappled yourself off.
Sorry, my phone is ringing. You know, I'm not an engineer. I don't have a hugely technical background. I've led engineering teams in different roles over the years. But one of the problems with this, I think, is that you often don't know exactly all of the technical details of the data that's being collected and how it's being used when you're managing a team that's responsible for it. So even with the best of intentions, and I think, you know, The Guardian takes data privacy incredibly seriously, but I don't know exactly, I think I have a relatively good understanding, but I don't know exactly how our collection and use of data takes place, because I'm not, you know, in the weeds doing this technical work myself. And that also creates a problem, because I think that misunderstanding, often really well-intentioned people will just misunderstand how the technology can and is being used, and that also creates a problem, because it's really complicated, right? It's really hard. I don't have a solution for this, unfortunately, other than just trying to educate yourself as much as you possibly can as you go through, and be really cautious when you are applying the collection and use of consumer data.
I want to move on to the geopolitics of TikTok, but I feel that we want to round off this conversation maybe by just briefly talking about the ideas around re-identification, given that it seems like it's leading straight from this conversation. Then we can give ourselves the second half of our discussion on TikTok and all things Chinese. Lizzie, you pointed out a decision that had been handed down by the Queensland Office of Information in the last week that was really raising concerns about government departments that have from all intents and purposes, de-identified data, but because the data is so specific, it isn't actually de-identified at all, and it's quite vulnerable to actually tracing the individual back. So why should we be concerned about that? And is it just a matter of one state government, or do you think this is a broader concern?
Yeah, I think this does flow on really nicely from some of the things Monika was raising, because when you collect data and you maybe want to release it or hand it to another agency or similar, the question is whether you've appropriately complied with the Privacy Act, and what is the role of data scientists in terms of complying with their obligations. And the point here is that under the Privacy Act, if you de-identify data, the provisions that usually apply to the protection of how you might be able to use personal information no longer apply. And so that's why lots of companies can share data between various departments within them. That's why government agencies often release public data sets, for example, to be available to researchers. It's why, for example, here in Victoria, we've had hackathons using data that's been made publicly available by various agencies en masse, so that you can try and solve some social problems or identify policy changes that might be useful. And the problem is that de-identification is often much more difficult than it might first seem. And this report from the Queensland Information Commissioner goes into that and talks about how a number of Queensland government agencies are probably not complying with their obligations. Queensland has a bunch of different public data sets available, and often quite sensitive information, people who are accessing certain kinds of healthcare services, for example, lots of different things online. And that's good for a research if you're interested in that field. But if you're a person who's in that data set, it can be very easy to re-identify you without much difficulty. And another friend of ours from these kinds of sessions, Vanessa Teague, who's a researcher, I'll post an article that she wrote actually about that a hackathon that took place in Victoria in relation to public transit data. And this mass data set was released so people could play around with it, and she very quickly, easily identified herself within the set. And lots of other people can too. It's actually extremely challenging to de-identify. You have to think really carefully about the risks. You can't just block out someone's name and expect it to then work. You know, part of the interesting thing about these big data sets is that you can trace through someone's journey through a particular health service or use of public transport, for example. And then that means you are more vulnerable to being able to be re-identified. And this is a real question, I think, that we haven't kind of grappled with properly in relation to privacy law. And I think we're going to see lots of instances where mass release of data sets or exchange of data between companies, for example, might not be considered lawful because they haven't done the work to de-identify it.
Dan, you're responsible for a lot of data that's collected by Guardian Australia. And also congratulations on your 150,000 paid supporters that you've reached this week.
Thank you.
All of which I'm sure are anonymous. But how do you manage a big data set, and how confident are you that what is put out there as being private information that's held in trust is actually done? So.
I'm very confident at the Guardian, but let me just take a step back. I mean, I'm going to talk about this in the context of targeted advertising, right? Because that is, I guess, what I have a reasonable amount of experience in. I think it's worthwhile probably just taking a step sort of through how this has evolved. So targeted advertising started with effectively, contextual advertising at first. So if you wanted to reach, for example, an audience that was interested in, I don't know, online gambling, for example, you would advertise in the sports sections. That was then evolved.
Interesting assumption, just quietly, but yes.
Yeah, well, yeah, probably you can probably take that as well. But,
yeah.
But anyway, as an example, or okay, let me go on a bit more vanilla.
Yeah.
A Hawaii holiday on the travel section. That then evolved to a cookie onto people's browsers and following them around the net and getting a bit more of an accurate picture of that. And then that evolved to be appended to collecting first-party data, so a consumer's name, address, age, the income bracket. There's a whole bunch of things that you can learn from someone over time. And at some point it went from being, there was a group of users that were interested in this thing and let's target advertising to them, to there is this individual and we have a really, really rich view of that individual and everything about them and psychographics, and let's target individually to them. I'm comfortable, and this is what the Guardian does, I'm relatively comfortable with collecting data on a bunch of consumers and putting them into segments, which it's impossible to identify an individual in that, because it is literally all the information that's available to be found is that individual, if you like, is split up into a whole bunch of different segments for targeted advertising purposes. What I am uncomfortable with is building up a really detailed profile of an individual user and then using that for targeting purposes. And that is what I think the bigger tech companies are typically doing, because they just collect so much information from us over the course of a week with us using their different apps or browsers or the Android operating system or whatever else. So I think that's the difference. I think if you're, from a targeted advertising point of view, putting someone into a segment and putting a target advertising to them based on that is something I'm relatively comfortable with. Identifying someone as being a 33-year-old with interests in this and these sort of politics, that's something which I'm deeply uncomfortable with. And I think that's what
I think the NBN's letting us down from across the Nullarbor at the moment. Do you want to jump in though? Like, I think you're just lagging a bit there at the moment, Dan.
Yeah, I think the advertising industry is hearing you give away their secrets, Dan. A bit worried about it. They're intervening into the call. I mean, look, I understand what you're saying, but part of my anxiety is like, I think that if you are going to release a data set to the public, you absolutely should do the work of de-identifying it, and that's a massive problem that government should contend with. But as a more general proposition, I still get very alarmed by how much data trading goes on behind the scenes between two companies, and I think most Australians would be pretty alarmed about it. And even if it's done in the abstract without my name being attached to something, you know, if I read an article in The Guardian that sort of suggests that I'm interested in alcohol or gambling or abortion, for example, and then that puts me in a certain category that maybe then I get to be advertised to, or the other kind of predatory industry in somewhere like the United States is the tertiary education providers, tertiary education providers in the private sector, who are just extremely relentless in trying to recruit people to take up courses that they often never finish, and then they're indebted to the private provider for many years to come. And I think even if your data isn't attached to you personally, being served kind of particular ads by predatory companies, whether they're gambling companies or payday lenders or any of these other kinds of industries that can be quite exploitative, I get very alarmed about how that can happen and what kind of data goes into curating those audiences for advertising. And so I do think there's a bigger problem with just assuming that de-identification is a cure-all for all these problems.
I think the other interesting debate is cookies. Like, I still cannot understand when cookies was ever deemed okay. And when you explain it to people how it works, that you visit a site and they attach a code to you and then they watch where else you go, it's outrageous. And it's part of our digital infrastructure. So, you know, is there a long-term future in this, or is there going to be a point at which, as people become more and more aware of what is being taken, there is a bit of a pushback there?
I think I'm not sure how much you got of what I said previously.
We got most of it. It just sort of started breaking up. Yeah.
Right. Yes, I think it was the nullable that's getting in the way. Look, I think the trend on cookies is pretty clear, Peter. I don't think it's you know, Safari has banned their use. Chrome has indicated that they're going to ban their use relatively soon, or at least significantly restrict it. One of the core sort of parts of GDPR, which came in Europe, was effectively asking for consumers' consent to be able to drop a cookie on a browser. You know, interestingly, the vast majority of people still do agree to that, which makes me question whether they actually understand exactly what is taking place there. But I think we are moving in a direction which is better, where this is going to, I think, become far less prominent. I don't know if cookies will disappear completely, but at the very least, the control of them is being ramped up, and that is a good thing.
All right. Do we feel like we've covered off? I feel I'm on the edge of my technical knowledge, but in terms of the re-identification discussion, final point, I guess, is there a regulatory response required here, Lizzie, or is this more just about organisations actually sticking to the laws that already exist?
Well, look, I think it depends who you're talking about. When in respect of government, I think we do need to have government agencies complying with their obligations and resources put in to doing so, and making sure that they've got the best expertise at their disposal, recruiting people to assist them, data scientists and the like, people like Monika, to come into their organisation and give them a realistic assessment of whether they're de-identifying data appropriately. And until they do that, they shouldn't be releasing these data sets publicly. And then there's a secondary question of, really, is this enough to regulate you know, private companies' use and trading of data? And I think a lot of the general public would be quite alarmed at how much data about them is shifting around between these companies. And I don't think it'll take much for these practices to start to change, but the public education piece, the public discussion piece, is pretty central to that. One of the things I think we need is like a royal commission into data sharing. There was a congressional inquiry in the US and it was quite scandalous. People were very alarmed about how it occurred. And we could then start to look at modelling changes like, you know, to comply with, for example, the data regulation in Europe, which I think is a first step, but it's a necessary step. And I think once we've had those kinds of discussions publicly, then we might get to that point and then start looking at, you know, even more, you know, more aggressive ways of regulating how this data changes hands so that we can better protect people online. Might harm Dan's business model. Sorry, Dan.
I know he's shifting his business model all the time and becoming more and more reliant on people that give to the Guardian rather than have to be
good, Dan. That's the spirit.
Now we've embarrassed
by the way, this is sort of coming to some extent. I mean, the ACCC's digital platforms report did identify a lot of the issues that you're talking about and made a number of recommendations, which are still pending, right? Or the actions on those are still pending. So it would harm our business model less than you would think, actually, Peter, because we tend to operate more in the contextual advertising space rather than the targeted follow you around the web sort of space. But anyway, I'll move on.
But it is such an amazing machine, isn't it? Like, it is the way that online companies make money now.
Sorry, one more. Can I just say one more thing, Dan? I don't mean to constantly make fun of you, but you happen to be the only person here, and that's why we do it. But one thing I would just say quickly is Sam raised the handsome face of online advertising, and we get to pummel him. Sam Floriani raised a really interesting point in the chat, which I should have mentioned, which is that a lot of these provisions around re-identification are actually criminalised, which doesn't help with this particular problem. Because when it comes to a public data set, I think the answer to identifying potential re-identification issues is not to criminalise people who do that, but in fact take that as a situation to change practices rather than shooting the messenger. That is a regulatory change I think we do need to implement with some urgency.
All right, let's get on to the third topic for the day, which is TikTok. And TikTok has become the centre of a geopolitical conflict between the United States and China. We would have seen in the news there are threats at the moment to ban the platform from America. So I want to start with my teenage daughter and then work out how she can be at the centre of a geopolitical conflict. So for those that don't get TikTok, and I can't pretend I do, it is effectively an app which allows you to make really simple user-generated video and then share it around. So often, and some of you may have seen Sarah Cooper, who is amazing, who does these TikToks where she lip syncs with Donald Trump, and it's kind of funny. But that's all it is, I thought. So people are making funny, ironic videos, often lip syncing with singers or speeches, and then they are watching other people doing it. And that seems to be the application, but it's compelling. I know AFSA uses it non-stop too, so we might see why she does it in a sec too. But Daniel, digging into it as we did this week, it's actually quite a transformative technology, isn't it? Because it's a real step forward from the sort of network effects that Facebook have put together.
Yeah, well, it's less dependent on your social network and more just effectively dependent on collecting a huge amount of user-generated content and then surfacing the content that is the most compelling and using their algorithm to do that. So you don't have the limitations, if you like, that you do on Facebook or Instagram or even Snapchat, where you're dependent on your network for that, for what you see. That's why it's such a hugely compelling. I mean, the algorithm is hugely effective at determining the best content that's most relevant to you as a user and targeting that content to you or you. Yeah, completely. Or anyone. That's the thing. It's entirely personalized.
So it's doing what Facebook does in micro targeting in advertising to every bit of content that comes in my feed. It's building up a profile of everything I look at and making. So that's interesting in itself. So that's why all these eyeballs are moving to it. Are you a TikToker, Lizzie? Do you TikTok, legal decisions or anything like that?
I don't actually TikTok, no. No, but someone did just make a comment then in the chat about it being like brain candy. And I do think it is an interesting comparison because, Facebook as well does kind of prioritize time on device by keeping people on there, by constantly stimulating them. And Facebook's got its own problems there because it can lead to extremism because you're given this positive feedback loop, which means you see more content that you already like and you're less inclined to encounter different kinds of views. And I mean, I think TikTok is similar. The design behind the algorithm is to keep people on there, keep consuming content. So it's very good at making it just right and specific to you, which can mean that you don't see alternative viewpoints. Again, this same kind of positive feedback loop, which I think does have implications for our understanding of democracy, our understanding of public participation, and what we understand to be kind of universal values, or how we frame public discussions about what those things are.
But it's not a political platform. So where is it? It's a sandpit. It's somewhere people are playing. So I'm interested in what is the threat that is being identified here. So, are
you sure about that, Peter? Because they did manage to organise themselves using TikTok to, mess up Donald Trump's rally. Isn't everything a bit political? Aren't all these platforms political? Yeah. I think it's a mistake to assume they're not.
Yeah. I don't know if Dan was trying to get in there or if he's being buffered across the Nullarbor at the moment. Have another crack, Dan.
Sorry, I think my internet connection is.
Yeah, one thing you might have to try to do is turn your video off.
I think I was about to make the same point you did, Lizzie, so apologies if this is repetitive. But
we might have to get you to turn your video. That's better.
Everybody.
Yeah, much better.
Okay, much better for everyone. Look, I think I was about to make the same point that you did, Lizzie. I share your concerns around. Well, there's lots of concerns. I share your concerns around the addictive nature of these applications. I think that creates problems. I have concerns around filter bubbles and the fact that we're effectively only seeing content that either reinforces or pushes us in a particular political point of view. But the concern with TikTok, which up till now, there were some data concerns around it, but was exactly what it managed to do to disrupt that Donald Trump rally. Now, putting aside my political viewpoints on a Donald Trump rally, the fact that a Chinese-owned company was able to prioritize content, which resulted in that rally being a significant number of users obtaining tickets to that rally with the express of not turning up, that is concerning to me, because that effectively is a clear disruption of the democratic process from an app which we have virtually no control over. That's the concern that I have with this above anything else.
So let's unpack that a little bit. So there was, it was portrayed as a K-pop protest. So all these people that like K-pop all of a sudden decided that Trump's rally could be disrupted. What we're saying here is that the algorithm has sort of prioritized that content and made it real, much the same way as Russian hackers interfered with the way that information was flowing through the last presidentials. The second bit that I've seen come out in the analysis and this concern about the platform is that whether or not the company is a government associated or separate company, if it's operating in China, the government has got much more expansive powers to access that data than, say, they would in the States with a Facebook. You know, on one way, the stuff that's being collected is pretty similar, but the interplay between the government and the platform is different because it's a different political culture. Is that a reasonable concern as well, Lizzie?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just get a little nervous when people say, well, like when Dan is talking there. What makes me a bit nervous about that is that, you know, Donald Trump is ripe to be made fun of and is vulnerable to overinflating his popularity, and then the reality being that he's not actually as popular as he thinks he is. I don't have a problem with people using social media platforms to organise, to kind of undermine his authority in that respect. I think that is part of the political process. So I understand why we need to question how these platforms are designed and who controls those decision-making, that decision-making process that is very important to how we consume these things and how we have public discussions. But I don't think we should necessarily assume that, that users aren't in a position to be able to work through that and also approach these platforms with some critical thinking skills. And really what we should be aiming for is all users having critical digital literacy is how I've seen other academics refer to it. You know, being able to approach these platforms and understand how they operate. That applies to TikTok, but it also applies to Facebook, which has its own problems with content moderation and its algorithm that prioritizes certain kinds of content. And then of course, Twitter as well. All these programs, all these platforms use algorithms to design what content you see. And so they're doing it for a particular purpose, and it may not be what you think it is. So let's try as a society to make sure that when we use them, we're approaching how we use them with some critical thinking skills so that we can make sure we're not, you know, we're not mistaken in what the significance is of how they work.
As our new technologist on the panel, Monika, what's your TikTok take?
I'm not a heavy user of TikTok. I think that in terms of the functionality, because it doesn't enable, I'm not sure, because I haven't used it much. I don't think it allows virality to the same extent that Facebook does. So like, you know, a harmful political message might not be able to spread as quickly, but correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't use TikTok. I do think it's like the format, the fact that it's audio visual as opposed to words means that there's just less that you can squash into that short message that's going to be able to politically influence people. And I also think that the issue of, you know, I mean, in terms of I'm not concerned about that. Look, it might be an unpopular view, but I'm not that concerned about the access of data, TikTok data, as opposed to Facebook data, because I think it's a much richer data set.
What about the interplay with TikTok and, for instance, the Hong Kong independence movement? To any of you, is there a difference between organising politically on a platform that is part of the Chinese government corporate infrastructure than, say, doing it on a Facebook or a Twitter?
I mean, if I can jump in, I definitely think there is, in the sense that, you know, TikTok does censor content. It does, you know, I'm sure of it, just like Facebook does as well. So I think when you're using these platforms to organise movements, you have to be doing it with an understanding that your interests may diverge from that platform, and that if you are kind of keen to avoid the negative consequences associated with citizenship, with censorship, you better have a backup plan for how to do that. So, I mean, I think these are social movements that are in the real world. They're real things. They're not just social media movements, and they may use these platforms as tools to get their message across. But I don't think we should always underestimate users that they haven't got any idea about how these platforms work. I think we do have a younger generation that is kind of more literate than I think a lot of people often give them credit for, in terms of understanding the dynamics that are at play here. And we shouldn't just, I think, necessarily approach them with suspicion because we assume that they are less critical thinking than we think.
You back online, Dan?
Yeah, just cut me off if I'm kind of breaking up, because you guys are for me, unfortunately. Apologies to everyone for this. I think there's a really important distinction to make here, though. I absolutely agree that there is nothing wrong with you know, people using the different social media platforms, including TikTok, potentially for engagement in the political process. I think that's fine. What I am concerned about, though, is with the company owned by ByteDance, which is you know, a Chinese company, is the potential for the Chinese government to do that without consumers knowing about it. That is, I think, the key difference. Now, most likely, I think that disruption of Donald Trump's rally was something which was entirely created by the users. I think, you know, that's most likely the circumstance. But we are seeing increasingly evidence of China engaging in trying to disrupt the political process on other social media platforms. And I think we should be concerned about their potential to do that here, to do with Facebook or other platforms for that matter.
So at the moment, we've got a real life discussion about TikTok being banned in the States. We know that Facebook is banned in China. Where does a country like Australia sit in that sort of social media platforms version of geopolitics? Do we do what we're trying to do, I think, still with the two relationships where we try to sort of straddle it, and so we keep Facebook and TikTok, or how's our way of dealing with these live debates about the way different political cultures are reflected in their technology?
I mean, I think that's kind of the perennial question that faces a country like Australia that has had its politicians traditionally aligned with the United States, but does sit, you know, kind of below its most significant neighbour to the north, which is China, and doesn't really contend with that in the way it ought to, I think. So, I mean, I think our future is in cultivating civil society, a population that is educated and informed about how these platforms work. And I don't think there's any shortcuts around that. I mean, I just think a lot of these things, you know, we can frame them as okay for the US to do, but not okay for China. And I appreciate it's not quite that simple, because the authoritarian government in China is worse, I think, than liberal democracies. But it is a question of the standards being lowered by, you know, bad behaviour by companies and national security agencies in places like the United States that facilitates this happening. I mean, the NSA was getting data off major telecommunications companies for a very long time, and we know about that thanks to Edward Snowden. These kinds of behaviours do happen in all governments, in all national security agencies. We do want to make sure that our own government is not doing that, and that's one of our responsibilities. And then I think we need to develop a culture where people approach these platforms critically, and that's our best bet to protecting democratic institutions, I think.
Monika, I'm interested again, just to you. In your profession, is there a sense, we've talked about ethics, but is there also a sense of the political economy of the technology that's being built, and particularly whether what you're building reflects Western liberal values?
I mean, because, so yeah, social media would be different to, I think, yeah, so two things. So if we're talking about social media, I don't think it reflects, because I mean, they're getting content for free. I think as Dan's, you know, I think gave some quote a few weeks ago about how much, you know, Guardian content, you know, goes through social media. It's reflective. It's very reflective of the user's values up until the point at which censorship occurs. And that's different depending on who owns the platform. So like, I wouldn't say it's Western or non-Western. You know, for example, there's different posts I get in my general feed to when I follow subtle curry traits. And that's, so that there's that kind of cultural element. There's a whole different issue when you're talking about the kind of, you know, products that data science might build to optimize a thing, whether it's advertising or whether it's, again, like jobs targeting. And I think Lizzie made the point of predatory, like advertising, where the inputs that they use to make decisions are based on past data that's come in. So all of the information they have, so if initially they primarily had, you know, say Western users with a particular income level where certain trends were prevalent, you know, in those income levels, then they're going to target their advertising or opportunities towards people that look like that. And then when you get the demographics of the people that are meant to be assessed by the optimizing algorithm change, then you might see radical losses of opportunity for people, or those models going completely haywire. So it's more the issue that as the those kind of everyday life impacting decision-making algorithms, as the demographic component changes, and as the habits that people come on, like culturally changes, the models no longer work, and the programmers aren't taught to be sensitive to the inputs.
Thanks for that, and thanks for your contribution today. Dan, you had one final point on the geopolitics.
Yeah, by the way, this is certainly not an area of expertise for me, but I think there is one quite black and white distinction that we should make with regards to whether we ban apps like TikTok or others, and that is that if the data is able to be obtained by a foreign government, then that is a problem. So I take your point, Lizzie. I mean, obviously, Snowden revealed a whole kinds of things that the US government were doing, which were atrocious. But nonetheless, that was not done with the company's consent, or in a way where the company could have no choice but to concede to the government's demand in a way that TikTok could theoretically, and that's why I'm concerned about it. I think any company which is either domiciled in China and therefore can be compelled to hand over data to that government, or in fact any other foreign government, and any company which stores data on foreign territory which can be obtained by that government, which includes Zoom, by the way, that is something which we should be concerned about. That is the distinction. I think that should not be allowed to take place, and we, as a you know, kind of global community, if you like, need to enforce that as we go forward, and that would, I think, alleviate a lot of these other problems. It won't solve, you know, many other problems we've touched on today, but it will at least make it impossible for a foreign government to gain access to data if it so chose to.
How could you enforce any more than enforcing, you know, the sovereignty of the South China Sea?
Well, if you take Zoom as one example, right, we're all on this. Technically, they have data centers within China. Theoretically, the government of China, and I'm sorry to keep singling them out, but it's obviously the most prominent at the moment, could access the data from that. I think that we should require companies such as Zoom to make sure that their data centers are not in territories where any foreign government can access that data if they chose to. With TikTok being owned by China, that is unfortunately pretty irreconcilable. There's lots of talk about them potentially, ByteDance potentially selling off TikTok to kind of get around this, and I think that might be the logical endpoint. So
the solution here is to get Facebook to buy TikTok, Lizzie?
That's not what I said, by the way.
Dan, yet again, coming up with a silly policy position.
No, he didn't say that. That was my silliness.
I think this is the new habit of these Zooms, is to verbal Dan. Yeah, I mean, obviously not. And, you know, Facebook has tried to do this kind of approach by replicating other models. Snapchat's the obvious one, where it produced stories and essentially put it out of business. I mean, that's one option, but, you know, better the devil you know is what some people think. I don't agree with that, but, you know, I do think it would be a massive problem if the solution to this is to just empower another tech giant to therefore have more control over our lives. So, yeah, let's think about that.
Or else we've just got to find other ways of ironically lip syncing and sharing it with our friends.
It's your project for the next fortnight, Pete.
Excellent. Hey, we're winding down the clock. Thanks for being part of the discussion. I hope it's useful. I'm learning, and I love that we get to sort of disagree in a fun and constructive way. So thanks for everyone that's participated in the chat. We'll keep these things going regularly. Next week, we've got a couple of events. On Monday, we've got the release of some research into the way young people are dealing with the whole catastrophe. And on Tuesday, I'll be back with Catherine Murphy. We're relaunching Essential Reports Two-Party Preferred, which hasn't been out since the last federal election. We've done a lot of soul searching and tweaking and rethinking the way we do political research, and we're going to be sharing that with you next Tuesday. So thanks, guys. Thanks, Lizzie. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Monika, for joining the panel, stepping up and turning on the camera. And yeah, we'll see you all again soon. So have a great rest of the day and a good weekend, and enjoy, or hang in there, Melbourne.
Thanks all.
Cheers.